Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I examine China's recent warning that there is no market for Japanese seafood, I see far more than a simple trade dispute. I see the unmistakable contours of the geoeconomic message, one directed not only at Tokyo, but at the entire Asia-Pacific region. As someone who has spent decades studying how great powers use economic leverage to shape political behavior, I recognize this pattern instantly. China is weaponizing market access to signal strategic boundaries. From my perspective, Beijing's statement is not spontaneous. It is a calculated escalation rooted in two converging dynamics. First is Japan's ongoing release of treated wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant, an issue that Beijing has strategically magnified to rally nationalist sentiment and to justify trade restrictions. Second, and even more important, is Tokyo's deepening political and security engagement with Taiwan. China views every gesture of support toward Taipei, whether symbolic or substantive, as a threat to its sovereignty narrative. By declaring that Japanese seafood has no market, Beijing is essentially saying your political choices carry economic consequences. And this is where the deeper logic emerges. China's leverage is enormous. Japan depends heavily on regional markets for its fisheries exports. And China historically has been one of the largest consumers. Cutting off or threatening to cut off this market is not merely punitive. It is a demonstration of mechanism of what China is willing to do when its geopolitical red lines are crossed. I interpret this as part of China's broader strategy of geoeconomic signaling, a form of coercion that is less costly than military escalation, but highly effective in shaping the region's strategic calculations. Beijing is reminding Japan and every other Asian nation that alignment with positions unfavorable to China can now trigger economically painful retaliation. Yet, as I analyze this situation, I must also point out that Japan will not simply fold under such pressure. Tokyo understands the stakes. If it yields now, it invites perpetual vulnerability. This is why the seafood dispute, despite appearing technical, is fundamentally political. It reflects Japan's determination to maintain strategic autonomy and protect its partnerships, especially with Taiwan and the United States, even under economic duress. What concerns me most, however, is the regional consequence of this dynamic. China's warning signals a future in which economic interdependence is no longer stabilizing. It has become a battlefield. Every country in the region, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, even ASEAN economies, will read this moment as a sign that China's economic strength is no longer a neutral force, but a tool of geopolitical correction. Thus, what begins as a seafood issue could, if mismanaged, reshape the political landscape of East Asia. Trade investment in regional supply chains may be increasingly filtered through national security lenses. And this, I must emphasize, is a trajectory that historically leads to fragmentation, not integration. China's warning is not just about fish. It is a declaration that economic relations in Asia now operate within a new ideological and strategic framework, one that demands careful, calibrated diplomacy if we wish to prevent the region from sliding into hardened blocks. When I evaluate China's decision to escalate its rhetoric and declare that there is no market for Japanese seafood, I see a strategic maneuver rooted in long-term geoeconomic thinking rather than a reactionary outburst. China is rarely impulsive in matters of foreign policy, especially when it concerns Japan, with whom it maintains one of the most intricate combinations of rivalry, interdependence, and geopolitical anxiety in Asia. To understand why this moment, why this issue, and why this tone, we must unpack Beijing's layered calculus. First, China is responding to what it perceives as an erosion of the status quo around Taiwan. Japan has not only deepened its political expressions of support for Taipei, but has tied its national security strategy more closely to Taiwan's fate. Tokyo's 2022 national security strategy openly names China as its greatest strategic challenge and frames Taiwan's stability as integral to Japan's own security. For Beijing, this represents a redrawing of the strategic landscape, one that demands a strong, unmistakable counter-signal. Economic pressure rather than military retaliation is the tool of choice. China understands that any overtly militaristic move risks reinforcing the U.S.-Japan security partnership. Economic measures, however, can exert real costs while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding a direct military confrontation. The message is clear. If Japan positions itself as a protector of Taiwan, China will make Japan pay an economic price. The Fukushima wastewater issue offers Beijing a convenient narrative vehicle. It allows China to justify its restrictions through environmental and health concerns while embedding the action within a much broader geopolitical message. The public framing protects China from accusations of naked coercion, even though the strategic intention is widely understood. Second, I view China's timing as deeply tied to domestic political dynamics. Like all major powers, China governs by managing the intersection of nationalism, economic legitimacy, and geopolitical posture. Stressing the risks of Japanese seafood allows Beijing to rally public sentiment, reinforce national cohesion, and redirect attention at a moment when domestic economic pressures, particularly in the real estate sector, challenge the state's policy credibility. By taking a firm stance against Japan, China reinforces its narrative of safeguarding national dignity and territorial integrity. But the third and perhaps most significant reason is China's evolving regional strategy. Beijing is increasingly using economic statecraft to shape the strategic environment of the Indo-Pacific. The no-market warning is not directed only at Japan. It is directed at every U.S. security partner in the region. China wants to establish a new rule of the game, aligning with Taiwan or adopting policies hostile to Beijing can bring tangible economic consequences. This pattern is not new. China imposed trade restrictions on South Korea over the THAAD missile defense deployment. It pressured the Philippines through tourism and fruit imports during the Scarborough Shoal dispute. It has used the same tools against Australia following calls for a COVID-19 origin investigation. Each case follows a similar logic. China is willing to weaponize market access to achieve geopolitical aims, but always under a cover of regulatory, health, or political justification. Powers economically, not just mid-sized states. In other words, China is no longer simply reacting to geopolitical conditions. It is actively shaping them. As I analyze this shift, I am struck by how profoundly it reshapes the economic foundations of the region. The Asia-Pacific once prospered on the assumption that economic interdependence would outweigh geopolitical conflict. That assumption is dissolving. Markets are now tools in a geopolitical contest. Trade flows are increasingly adjustable levers of influence. National security, not efficiency, is driving economic strategy. And here lies an uncomfortable truth. Japan cannot disengage from China without incurring vast economic costs. China remains its largest trading partner. Japanese companies are deeply embedded in China's manufacturing ecosystem. Supply chains, investment flows, and export markets all bind the two economies together. This interdependence, once celebrated as a stabilizing force, has become a vulnerability. China knows this, Japan knows this, and the region is watching. Thus, China's message is not about fish, it is about future order. By challenging Japan economically over a symbolic yet politically charged issue, Beijing asserts its ability to reshape regional behavior without firing a shot. To me, the warning is unmistakable. The Asia-Pacific is entering an era where economic coercion becomes the primary instrument of statecraft. And unless diplomatic mechanisms evolve to handle this new reality, we may soon find the region caught in an accelerating cycle of pressure, retaliation, and strategic fragmentation. When I assess Japan's response to China's sharp warning about the lack of a market for Japanese seafood exports, I see a country caught in a familiar but increasingly uncomfortable dilemma: defend its economic lifelines or defend its strategic posture. Japan cannot do both simultaneously without cost, and in this moment the costs are rising rapidly. As I observe Tokyo's early signals, it is clear that Japan is trying to position itself as the responsible actor, calm, technocratic, and rule-bound. This is the classic Japanese diplomatic style. Officials emphasize scientific evidence, demand that trade restrictions be proportionate, and seek to reassure the region that Japan is not escalating tensions. Yet beneath this posture lies a deeper anxiety. Japan cannot afford to lose the Chinese market, and Tokyo knows it. China remains Japan's largest trading partner. Japanese seafood exports to China and Hong Kong represent a significant share of Japan's fishing industry revenue. The moment Beijing hints at further curbs, Tokyo understands the economic threat immediately. This is why Japan's first response has not been military, rhetorical, or ideological. It has been administrative and evidentiary. Japan accelerates inspections, publicizes radiation testing, and attempts to create technical reassurance. In essence, we are compliant, we are transparent, we are not the aggressor. But the problem is not technical, it is political. China's warning arrives not primarily because Beijing is concerned about radioactive contamination. After all, the scientific consensus on the treated wastewater issue is well established. Instead, China is using trade as political leverage in a broader strategic game. And Japan, despite knowing this, must pretend otherwise, because acknowledging the political nature of the dispute would force Tokyo into a direct confrontation with Beijing, something it wants to avoid. So what does Japan do? It will follow a three-track response: economic mitigation, diplomatic stabilization, and strategic signaling. First, economic mitigation. Japan will immediately expand subsidies to its fishing sector, diversify export markets to Southeast Asia, and accelerate partnerships with domestic retailers to absorb unsold seafood. We have seen this before. When China halted imports following the Fukushima water release, Tokyo mobilized billions of yen to stabilize fishermen's incomes. They will do it again because political escalation is far more costly than financial compensation. Second, diplomatic stabilization. Japan will quietly reach out through back channels, especially via South Korea, ASEAN partners, and business associations that maintain deep ties with Beijing. Tokyo understands that public confrontation fuels nationalist sentiment in both countries, reducing room for negotiation. Japan's task, therefore, is to depoliticize what is inherently political. The preferred message: let us separate trade from geopolitics. Of course, China is unlikely to do so, but Japan must at least demonstrate diplomatic good faith to prevent further escalation. Japan will also attempt to involve international institutions, WTO committees, regional fisheries organizations, and IAEA scientific bodies to frame itself as the rational, rules-based actor. This is textbook Japanese diplomacy. Widen the table so China appears isolated if it refuses to participate. Third, strategic signaling. Although Japan wants to de-escalate economically, it cannot appear weak strategically. This is where Tokyo will respond not through trade, but through alignment. I expect Japan to strengthen ties with Taiwan's newly elected leadership, not loudly, but deliberately. Japan will intensify Coast Guard cooperation, increase intelligence sharing with the U.S., Indo-Pacific Command, and highlight its commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. These are symbolic gestures, but they carry weight. Japan's broader strategic calculus is simple. If China uses economic coercion, Japan will respond, not by retaliating economically. Japan cannot win that game, but by tightening security cooperation with Washington. Beijing knows this, and Tokyo knows that Beijing knows it. This mutual awareness creates a delicate balance where both sides push, but neither pushes too far. However, Japan also recognizes its regional responsibility. It understands that an economic tit for tat between the world's second and third largest economies would destabilize East Asian supply chains, exacerbate inflation, and pressure neighboring states to choose sides. Japan does not want to trigger such an outcome. In fact, Japan's philosophy, consistent since the 1972nd, has been that East Asian stability is built through economic integration, not strategic fragmentation. Thus, Japan must walk a tightrope. It must defend its dignity without provoking confrontation, protect its economy without appearing submissive, and maintain strategic alignment without losing regional trust. This delicate equilibrium is not new for Japan, but the pressure has intensified. China is more assertive, Taiwan is more politically charged, and the U.S.-China rivalry is deeper than at any point since the 1972nd. If I step back and view Japan's response through a philosophical lens, I see a nation attempting to practice what Aristotle might call phronesis, the practical wisdom of navigating conflicting obligations without losing ethical center. Japan seeks neither domination nor retreat. Instead, it seeks stability, because for Japan, stability is strategy. And this is precisely why Japan's response will be measured technocratic and de-escalatory. It is not weakness. It is strategic restraint. Japan understands that the greatest danger in East Asia today is not conflict itself, but the miscalculation that leads to conflict, and Tokyo is determined not to be the one that miscalculates. When I examine the regional economic implications of China's warning to Japan, framed bluntly as the absence of a market for Japanese seafood, I see far more than a bilateral dispute. What appears at first glance as a trade conflict is, in fact, a stress test for the entire East Asian economic architecture. And from my vantage point as a longtime observer of global systems, I can say with certainty the ripple effects will extend well beyond seafood or fisheries. This episode exposes the vulnerability of a region whose prosperity depends on interdependence, but whose politics increasingly shift toward confrontation. The first layer of economic fallout is obvious: market disruption. Chinese bans or restrictions have immediate consequences. Japan's fisheries face collapsing export volumes, insurance costs rise, domestic prices fluctuate, supply chains reroute abruptly. These effects do not remain within Japan. South Korean distributors, Taiwanese retailers, and Southeast Asian hospitality sectors, all interconnected through the regional seafood trade, must adjust quickly. For many small and medium enterprises across the region, uncertainty itself becomes a cost. But far more important is the signal effect China sends to the region. Beijing is demonstrating that it can and will weaponize market access whenever politically necessary. Asian economies have long benefited from China's growth, but they are increasingly aware of the corresponding risk. The larger China becomes, the greater its leverage over their export-driven economies. This dynamic produces a profound strategic anxiety. Countries such as South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand are quietly asking themselves, if Japan can be hit this quickly, what protects us? In this sense, China's warning functions as a regional reminder of asymmetry. And asymmetry introduces caution, self-censorship, and strategic hedging. These are not abstract factors. They influence investment decisions, supply chain diversification, and long-term trade strategies. I have seen similar patterns emerge in other regions, Latin America vis-a-vis the United States, or Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Russia. In East Asia, however, the economic stakes are significantly higher. Another critical consequence lies in the fragmentation of regional supply chains. East Asia's success has been built on shared production networks, components from Japan assembly in China, logistics through Korea or Singapore, and distribution across ASEAN. When political tensions interfere with trade flows, companies begin to diversify, not because they want to, but because they must. The de-risking narrative promoted by the United States and increasingly embraced by Europe finds new momentum whenever China exerts economic pressure. Japan's seafood may be the present case study, but investors interpret it as part of a much broader pattern. Multinational corporations, from automotive to semiconductors to energy, will respond by redistributing risk across multiple Asian countries. We will likely see increased Japanese investment in Vietnam, Indonesia, and India as companies seek buffer zones against geopolitical shocks. This shift may ultimately weaken China's central role in regional supply chains, though Beijing will continue to maintain overwhelming economic weight. The third implication concerns the political economy of ASEAN. Southeast Asian nations are the region's economic hinge, deeply dependent on China for trade, but reliant on stability and rules-based governance to sustain growth. When they witness China pressuring a major economy like Japan, they read the warning clearly. Many ASEAN governments do not want to choose sides, but episodes like this make neutrality harder. They will accelerate trade partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and India. They will quietly deepen security dialogues with the United States, and they will cautiously distance themselves from decisions that could provoke Chinese retaliation. Ironically, China's pressure on Japan may yield the opposite effect. Beijing desires a more coordinated, though unspoken, alignment among middle powers seeking economic insulation from Chinese leverage. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and ASEAN will find common cause in safeguarding supply chain stability. This is not military alignment, it is economic self-preservation. The fourth implication is philosophical, but no less consequential: the erosion of regional trust. East Asia has thrived because its economies accepted the premise that economic integration reduces conflict. Now, trust is weakening. China's actions, even if strategically rational from its own perspective, feed a narrative that interdependence is becoming a liability rather than an asset. This psychological shift matters profoundly. Trust is the currency that allows supply chains to stretch across borders. When trust declines, efficiency declines with it. Finally, I see the risk of a new regional economic architecture emerging, not by design, but by drift. China continues to consolidate its influence through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. The United States promotes alternative frameworks such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Japan and South Korea are caught between these poles. The seafood dispute pushes Japan closer to the U.S., aligned economic orbit, even as Japanese companies still rely deeply on the Chinese market. These contradictions will shape East Asia's trajectory for years to come. In sum, China's warning to Japan is not merely a trade retaliation. It is a demonstration of power, a test of regional resilience, and a catalyst for economic realignment. East Asia's prosperity has long depended on delicate equilibrium. What we are witnessing now is that equilibrium slowly tilting, perhaps temporarily, perhaps irrevocably. And the challenge for the region is simple. Can East Asian countries adapt to this new reality without triggering deeper fragmentation? The answer will define the next chapter of Asian economic history. When I analyze the geopolitical consequences of China's warning to Japan over seafood exports, I see far more than an economic dispute or a bilateral tension. What emerges is a microcosm of a much deeper shift in global power structures. East Asia is entering a phase where even minor trade signals carry strategic meaning. And as I observe this dynamic unfold, I believe the region is being quietly reshaped by three converging pressures: China's ascent, America's re-engagement, and Japan's recalibrated strategic identity. Let me begin with the most direct consequence, the widening of the U.S.-China rivalry into yet another policy domain. Whenever China exerts pressure on an ally of the United States, especially an ally as central as Japan, it inevitably deepens Washington's involvement. The United States views Japan not merely as a partner, but as the cornerstone of its Indo-Pacific strategy. If China signals that economic coercion is a valid tool against Tokyo, Washington will interpret it as a test of alliance credibility. We have seen similar episodes before when China restricted exports to South Korea after the THAAD missile deployment. Washington strengthened defense cooperation with Seoul. When Beijing pressured Australia economically after political disagreements, the United States responded by reinforcing the Quad. The logic is consistent. China uses economic leverage. The U.S. counters through security commitments. The Japan seafood episode will follow this pattern. Thus, one geopolitical consequence is the tightening of U.S.-Japan strategic coordination. This will not be expressed through threats or escalatory rhetoric. Instead, we will see deeper joint planning, expanded intelligence cooperation, and renewed emphasis on maritime security in the East China Sea. In other words, China's trade signal will accelerate the very strategic consolidation Beijing seeks to prevent. The second consequence concerns Japan's evolving geopolitical identity. For decades, Japan maintained a posture of defensive diplomacy, economically assertive but politically cautious. Today, that identity is shifting. As I observe Tokyo's behavior, I see a country increasingly prepared to assume a more proactive strategic role. China's economic pressure reinforces this trend. Japan's leadership and its public are slowly concluding that economic dependence on China comes with unacceptable political costs. This realization will likely accelerate Japan's military modernization, deepen cooperation with Taiwan, and strengthen policy alignment with democratic partners across the Indo-Pacific. In short, China's warning pushes Japan to shed its last reservations about adopting a more explicit strategic stance. The third consequence is the pressure placed on middle powers and regional actors, particularly in Southeast Asia. ASEAN states do not want to choose between China and Japan, much less between China and the United States. But episodes like this force their hand. If China escalates economic coercion, ASEAN will quietly but unmistakably lean toward a more balanced strategy, expanding ties with Japan, South Korea, and India to hedge against Chinese dominance. This is not anti-China behavior. It is survival behavior. Middle powers seek policy space. When major powers narrow that space, they adapt by diversifying their alignments. Thus, China's pressure may create a regional counterweight, not a formal coalition, but a shared instinct among smaller states to preserve autonomy. A fourth geopolitical consequence lies with Taiwan. Beijing's warning came in the context of Taiwan's political statements, which China interpreted as provocative. By linking trade pressure against Japan with Taiwan's rhetoric, China signals that it expects the region to restrain Taipei. Japan, however, cannot publicly reprimand Taiwan without undermining its own strategic posture. As a result, Japan is caught in a delicate position: protect its economic interests or protect its strategic relationship with Taiwan. Tokyo will choose the latter, and that choice further complicates China's calculus. In this sense, China's warning, intended as a message to both Japan and Taiwan, may instead strengthen the Japan-Taiwan connection. The geopolitical implication is unmistakable. The more China pressures regional actors, the more their strategic interests converge. Finally, I want to address the broader philosophical shift this conflict represents. East Asia has long operated under an implicit assumption that economic integration prevents political conflict. That assumption is eroding. China's readiness to use trade tools for political objectives and Japan's growing willingness to respond strategically rather than economically suggests that economics can no longer insulate the region from geopolitics. We are entering a phase where every economic dispute becomes a strategic indicator. Trade is no longer neutral. Supply chains are no longer apolitical. Market access is no longer guaranteed. This is the world of strategic interdependence, a world where prosperity and power are inseparable, and the region must now adapt to this reality. China's warning to Japan is not merely a disagreement over seafood. It is a reminder that the geopolitical environment of East Asia is shifting toward a more contested, more polarized, and more fragile configuration. The stability that has underpinned decades of growth is no longer assured. The question is not whether the region understands this. It does. The question is whether it can adjust. Finally, I see the risk of a new regional economic architecture emerging, not by design, but by drift. China continues to consolidate its influence through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. The United States promotes alternative frameworks such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Japan and South Korea are caught between these poles. The seafood dispute pushes Japan closer to the U.S., aligned economic orbit, even as Japanese companies still rely deeply on the Chinese market. These contradictions will shape East Asia's trajectory for years to come. In sum, China's warning to Japan is not merely a trade retaliation. It is a demonstration of power, a test of regional resilience, and a catalyst for economic realignment. East Asia's prosperity has long depended on delicate equilibrium. What we are witnessing now is that equilibrium slowly tilting, perhaps temporarily, perhaps irrevocably. And the challenge for the region is simple: can East Asian countries adapt to this new reality without triggering deeper fragmentation? The answer will define the next chapter of Asian economic history. From this vantage point, the present tensions are not merely a seafood dispute nor a diplomatic spat over words. They represent an early warning signal of a more troubling drift, the normalization of strategic economic pressure as a first resort instrument of politics. China's caution, Japan's defensive posture, and Taiwan's politicized entanglement are each symptoms of a broader regional insecurity exacerbated by the U.S.-China rivalry. Strategic mistrust now moves faster than diplomacy. Market reactions outpace political restraint. My final assessment is that East Asia is entering a period where economic tools will be intertwined with geopolitical contestation, but this trajectory is neither inevitable nor irreversible. With deliberate leadership, the region can still preserve the economic openness that has underpinned its sociopolitical stability. To that end, I propose 5 policy recommendations. 1, de-escalate through technical verification rather than political signaling. We have seen similar episodes before when China restricted exports to South Korea after the THAAD missile deployment, Washington strengthened defense cooperation with Seoul. When Beijing pressured Australia economically after political disagreements, the United States responded by reinforcing the Quad. The logic is consistent. China uses economic leverage. The U.S. counters through security commitments. The Japan seafood episode will follow this pattern. Thus, one geopolitical consequence is the tightening of U.S.-Japan strategic coordination. This will not be expressed through threats or escalatory rhetoric. Instead, we will see deeper joint planning, expanded intelligence cooperation, and renewed emphasis on maritime security in the East China Sea. In other words, China's trade signal will accelerate the very strategic consolidation Beijing seeks to prevent. The second consequence concerns Japan's evolving geopolitical identity. For decades, Japan maintained a posture of defensive diplomacy, economically assertive but politically cautious. Today, that identity is shifting. As I observe Tokyo's behavior, I see a country increasingly prepared to assume a more proactive strategic role. If Japan responds to Chinese pressure by tightening its own restrictions on Chinese imports or by aligning more aggressively with U.S. containment measures, the region could descend into a tit-for-tat WTO irrelevant economic battlefield. East Asia's production networks from seafood to microchips are too interconnected to survive a spiral of punitive measures. Both Tokyo and Beijing should adopt minimum necessary intervention as a guiding norm. 4. Prepare ASEAN to serve as a stabilizing economic anchor. Southeast Asia has the most to lose from a fractured regional economy and the most to gain from facilitating diplomatic stabilization. ASEAN should expand its quiet diplomacy role by hosting technical dialogues on food safety, maritime resource management, and trade transparency. A neutral platform reduces political costs for all parties. 5. Align regional economic governance with global sustainability goals. Environmental issues, from marine ecology to carbon-intensive shipping, should be reframed not as national vulnerabilities, but as shared responsibilities. China, Japan, and Taiwan can transform a moment of tension into a platform for joint marine conservation projects under the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 14. Cooperative stewardship is the best antidote to zero-sum thinking. In conclusion, the current dispute is a reminder of how fragile the region's peace architecture has become, but it is also an opportunity, a prompt for East Asia to recalibrate its approach to economic statecraft. If the major regional actors embrace transparency, de-escalation, and institution building, the Asia-Pacific can remain not a theater of confrontation, but a model of stability grounded in mutual benefit. The choice is still open. The responsibility is collective.